the Healthy Start Project. Candace also has a special interest in genetics. And this afternoon, Candace is going to be bringing to you her discussion on helping mothers defend their decision to breastfeed. So join me in welcoming Candace.
Thank you for asking me to do this, and I want to thank our IT support. Edwin was here during the 6 months that I ran this study, and it was our IT, so it's nice to have him. Nice to have him here providing the IT for today also. So here's the story. I was an LPN, and I was working in women's health, so facelifts, tummy tucks, you know, that kind of surgeries, like really clean and really nice, and you know, single rooms for everybody. And they brought the entire mother-baby floor down to me and said, "Poof, you're a mother-baby nurse," just like that. And so I breastfed my own children, but I had no clue how to help someone else breastfeed, not a clue. And so I went to LHA League, and Valerie McLean was my league leader at the time, and she really helped me help these moms because I was totally at a loss. So I owe League a big debt. Loaned me all kinds of books, videos, you name it, whatever I needed, any call I had, any questions, she was really, really great to help me with. And then I started coming to FLCA so I could get my cert so I could take the board. So in '97 I took the board, and I'm a good test taker. And I scored the highest that year. And what they do, if you get that, actually Pat Martin's was the high score, but she was recertifying. So I was actually second. But they send you to write the next test, and which is very cool. It's a very interesting thing to do. It's a beautiful test. They have a psychometrician there the whole time that you're working on these questions and crafting this test. It has to be translated into 11 different languages. But it was really nice. So Kay Hoover was on that year. Right? Yeah, so I got to meet some very nice people. The lady from Ball State, her name leaves me at the moment, another lady from Germany. So it's really quite a way to be welcomed into the lactation consultant profession, you know, and really see these awesome people who did awesome research. And Pat Martin's was a really great gal. And I was working for Joan Meek for a few years at Orlando Health, and when you start research, it's because something bugs you. You know, something just isn't making sense, and something just isn't right, and it's just like a little bug. And I thought, what was really bothering me is why don't we know what the fastest way to heal a nipple injury is? And when I went to look in the literature, they had this would work, that would work, this worked, that worked, and everybody was saying something different. And I said, oh, well, let's just do a research study. Dummy. I had no idea what would be involved in doing a research study. So in 2001, this little ADN nurse decided she would go ahead and get enough education so I could do a research study. I did not know that was going to lead me 15 years later to a PhD. But that's how it works. So this part of it, this dissertation part, has been 5 years in the making. So you're going to see this, it's like an anatomy of a research study. So those of you who are going to be taking boards or needing that kind of review for boards, we'll go over the anatomy of a research study. And I stole a lot from Pat Martin's stuff. So I have really no disclosures to make other than the Lactation Consultant Association gave me their nice grant in 2011 for this project, and the Florida Nursing Association also funded me. My advisor is Karen O'Ryan, who knows nothing about breastfeeding, nothing. There wasn't one person on my committee that knew anything about maternal-child health, much less breastfeeding. So it was quite a journey. But I did have some great support through it. Annette Leary was my research assistant through it, and she was. I think I would have absolutely floundered if I didn't have her help. So I give credit where credit is due. Let's see. Okay, so here are the pieces of a research study. If we're doing this, so you know the whole world of research is kind of divided between qualitative studies and quantitative studies. So if it's got statistics in it, it's probably a quantitative study. And the two statistics you probably need to remember is a p-value, which you want to be less than 0.05. Another one you might want to remember is what's called a Cronbach, an alpha. So we'll talk about those. But the p-value is what you need to know if you're reading research studies. So we start with an abstract that gives like a little short summary of what a research study is. And then we have to define the problem. What is that thing that bugged us, that led us down this path to solve this issue, this problem? So that has to be laid out. And then we have to tell you why anybody should care. So that's what the significance is. It's the who cares part. So if we have a problem, who cares about it? Well, the data that tells us what the consequences of this issue are what tells us what's significant. So then it has to have some kind of a framework so that you can evaluate the issue in a very rigorous and thorough manner. So we get into this very abstract world of theory here, and for the most part what are known as middle range theories. And you will test your intervention, your experiment against the constructs of that theory, and it's going to define what you do. So you have to have a really good understanding of the theory you use to frame it. So that's really abstract, but we'll have to go through it anyway. You have to do a literature review. So you need to find out who else has looked at this problem, what they know about it. You need to know what the existent knowledge is. So you do that literature review. And I know you've seen some big literature reviews. They call them systematic reviews, or the Cochrane reviews. Those maybe ring a bell, where they're looking at mother support was probably the big one. You know, when they did the Cochrane review for, you know, what is good mother support, and they keep redoing that every so many years. But this is a much smaller literature review, the one that I have to do for inside the study. So this is a little rich. It won't hurt you too much. Then we have to do the methods. Once we have what we need to accomplish laid out, then we have to lay out the exact type of method. So the type of question that I had, or the type of problem I have, is going to determine the design, the research design. So it can be descriptive. So a lot of our surveys are descriptive, right? They're just telling us about what's out there. That's what descriptive. This one has a little bit of a descriptive component to it, but this was actually an experiment. So we had, you know, controlled a group A that didn't get the experiment and a group B that did. So this is that type of study. We have to decide how many people have to be in our study. So whenever you're reading a research study, you have to look and see if they have done what's called a power and sample size analysis. So that just because they had 50 people do the study doesn't mean that that's enough strength of the evidence to determine if you solved the problem. So you want to, they will say that, and they'll say that in their little analysis, their data analysis section. They'll tell you if they did a power analysis. In a lot of our older research on breastfeeding, we didn't do that, but we do now. You'll see it certainly in the Journal of Human Lactation or the Breastfeeding Medicine. They will go through those steps. The data analysis plan tells me which statistical test I'm going to apply to answer a specific research question, and it gives me parameters for that, and I'll tell you what those are. And then we have the intervention. So you have a group that got nothing and a group that got the experimental part, so the intervention in a quasi-control is called an intervention. And we have to have tools that measure things like the intake form. So we need to know, you know, how old is the mom? Has she ever breastfed before? So that's a tool. It's like an intake tool, a demographic tool, or characteristic tool. Then there might be other tools that might be little surveys, and we might have those. And those have to be psychometrically sound, and we'll analyze those, and I'll explain what to look for when we get that part. And then we can talk about the results. What actually happened? Did it work or didn't it work? And we'll discuss it, because you take what we learned from this, and we have to weigh it against what we already know. Does it fit? So you might have results that don't make sense, right? So then it doesn't fit, and it's not worth talking about. So you have to take what you did and integrate it into what we already know and see, does it fit? And it might be something startling and new. This is not. And then we drew conclusions. So that's it. That's the way all quantitative research studies that are experimental are structured, just like that. And a lot of our clinical research is that. So in this one, our abstract was to determine if negative messages about infant feeding could be remedied. So I know, working as a lactation consultant, there are 11 different ways people try to tell these mothers that the baby really just needs formula. Right? So they are vulnerable. These moms are really vulnerable to these influences. And what I was looking for was a way to help them defend against those probably well-intended things. I'm not willing to say that people were nasty about it. I just think that they just don't know any better, and these moms need to know how to defend against that. So that's what this whole project was about, was that. Because the original study that I was doing about the nipple injury, okay, remember, I didn't want to be known as the nipple lady. So if the first thing you publish is about nipples, it's Kay Hoover. What do you think of when you think of Kay Hoover? Candidiasis of the nipple, right? And I didn't want that. So I did this instead, so you would think of me and think of a game instead.
Which is to come.
Yeah. Yep. Here we go. Okay, so there I was with the dilemma that I knew I didn't want to be the nipple lady, and I had to figure out what kind of problem I needed to attack. So I had to look, because this also tells me what can also screw up my data. But these are factors that influence breastfeeding. That's not everything. It's not a comprehensive list, but it's pretty thorough. And these are things that I can account for inside of a research study. I can control for them so they don't affect my data. So it is not an exhaustive list because I didn't update it from when I sent the proposal in, but it's pretty good. And you'll notice that negative messages or persuasion, none of that's on there. It's not there. So I had a problem that people weren't writing a lot about. So that's a good thing. Right? So it would bring something new to us. So what I decided to do was, because we weren't meeting our Healthy People 2020 goals, we all know that, and we know there are lots of barriers. The barrier I wanted to look at was negative messages. You know, how to help them defend against the people that are telling them to get this baby formula. And there was a real gap in the literature. Nobody had really been writing about it. There were no explicit strategies, no tactics to help women do that. So that's what I decided to do. I could do that. You know, I could take a look at that and see if there's something I could do to make it better. And one thing stuck in my mind as I was reading, but do you remember the Jalif and Jalif, the people who coined the term commerciogenic malnutrition back in the Nestle's boycott days? I mean, we're going way back there. But they were a husband and wife team. He was a nutritionist, and he did a lot of global research, not necessarily here in the United States, but a lot of global research. And he was convinced that breastfeeding was primarily an issue of confidence. Successful breastfeeding meant the woman needed to be confident. She needed to be able to trust that her body could do this and that she had everything she needed to provide for her baby. And he was absolutely convinced that this was a critical issue. And all of these negative messages are attacking that. Right? They're undermining her faith in herself and the ability she has to mother her baby the way she wants to and breastfeed. So that really stuck in my mind too, reading his research and his wife's research about confidence. So that helped me hone it. But so here we get to the part why do we care? Like, who cares? Well, this is the significance part. So all of this, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you know all of this already. But we know that there are health, even in developed countries, even in the good old US of A or the UK or anywhere in Western Europe, we still have better outcomes for mothers and babies regarding health if they breastfeed. And we know that it's dose dependent, that the more they breastfeed and the longer they breastfeed, the greater those benefits are. And it's been quantified, and this probably needs to be updated too, because I know Barczyk has done some more research on benefits to mothers specifically, but it's critical in the point, if you think of a young family with limited resources and they're having to spend money on formula, they don't have to. They just have to spend money on a glass of milk and a peanut butter sandwich extra a day. You know, it's not that many calories. that they need. So it's very economical for families to be able to do that. But more importantly, it saves on the cost of taking care of sick kids, right? So mom's not out sick from work, so she's not losing time from work, and the employer's not out that employee that day. So you know all of these reasons on why it's significant that we want to increase breastfeeding rates. So I love this, Regina Benjamin. What an awesome, good woman. She really is. She, Louisiana, right? Louisiana, and not a mother herself, but valued the research that was brought to her about breastfeeding. And as Joe Meek talked about this, what was it, a couple of weeks back, about what that means when we have a call to action. She said that means that we have to marshal a lot of resources to target this problem. And the problem is continually updated over time until it's fixed. So it's an ongoing, until we get these rates where we want them to be, this will continue. So we will continue to have the support of the Surgeon General's office and the funding that that brings to people that want to do programs, whether it's through, if you're in WIC and you're going through the FDA, or if you're, in healthcare and you're going through NIH, but that's where your program money can come from. So I would say that that particular piece that she did in 2011 has done so much good, so that it will be continually renewing funds that are being targeted to help our mothers and babies in various ways to solve the problem of how to get moms and breastfeeding and meet those Healthy People 2020 goals, really. And it was actually a great document. She gave very nice, well, she did personally, but the committee did, gave their key things on what they think we need to do as a nation to get us there. And we have measures that we can evaluate how we are getting there. So it's not just our breastfeeding rates. There are actually some key pieces along the way that are being measured, and constantly that's happening. So MPINC is one of the ways we look at that. And I know you all know about MPINC. So now I know it's really important. Now I need that theory. I need that framework. I need that strategy. I need that tactic. How is it I'm supposed to tell them? I can't just tell them it's better for you to breastfeed, or tell them to go take a hike if they tell you something you don't want to listen to. That's not going to work. I needed a theory. So in my PhD studies, we had to look at these theories, which is the philosophy course or the nursing theory courses. I don't know if you've ever had to take those. I'm a concrete person, a do-it person, right? I'm very practical, and these are very abstract, all these theories. It's really hard for me to digest, but I found one. I found one that I thought could work. So it's called the Inoculation Theory of Resistance to Influence. And what this is, it's just like an immunization, right? You give them a little dose of a bad message, and that immunizes them. It wakes them up that they can be attacked, their belief can be attacked, and it helps them learn to develop how to resist that influence. Just like an immunization helps us to build antibodies against an invading microorganism. So that's the analogy for this theory, but it's a brilliant theory, and it's been around forever, but we just never used it in healthcare. So in the 1950s, during the Korean War, those of you who are my age or older probably remember this, that when the Korean soldiers were being brainwashed, right? Do you remember hearing about that word, brainwashed? So what they needed in the Department of Defense, they did a call to action to do research to help people be able to defend their decisions or their beliefs. So that's where this came from. It was a way to help inoculate our soldiers in the event that they were captured and risked brainwashing, that they would have the wherewithal to be able to defend their beliefs. Because the soldiers that were brainwashed were, in general, younger. They were poorly educated, and they really had no experience at all in having to defend these beliefs that we take for granted, that American way is the way to live, right? So that's where this came from. We didn't use it in healthcare, but by golly, they've used it in tons and tons of other research. But it's a teachable thing. People can be taught to defend their beliefs. They can be taught. It's a skill that we teach them. And the inoculation treatment, that method, the way we teach it. That's the intervention. That's the key. So, let's see. This was 1964. McGuire published this theory, and in very short order, a whole bunch of other people jumped on that and made use of it. But not healthcare. Healthcare really didn't get there. I think I will be the first to use it. So, but where you hear this is in marketing. Oh my gosh, it's in marketing. So you know when you hear about brand loyalty, they're trying to keep their loyal people loyal. In politics, and I thought this was a really great example. So I don't know whatever happened to Robert Novak, but he was a hardcore Republican, but he was really a great writer. But he used this word. What they were doing was inoculating their base. Have you heard that phrase in politics? They're inoculating their base. So in the advance of some bad news coming out, they'll send out a message to their troops, to their core believers, that will prepare them to be able to defend against bad news that's coming, right? So they have to have an existing core belief. That's the first thing that has to happen. They have to have that first, and then we're looking at ways to shore that belief up. So it's not making a new belief. It's shoring up a belief they already have. So like our moms, they want to breastfeed. What is it? 90% of them say they want to breastfeed. And how many actually breastfeed? How many are actually breastfeeding at 6 months? And how many are exclusively breastfeeding? They all want to. They all want to. So they have that core belief that they want to breastfeed. They want to do it the way it's recommended. So they're a game for this. They would be good candidates for this intervention. So in healthcare campaigns, these were actually done for the most part in schools, and I'll detail these pretty carefully. But they were trying to get people to not binge drink or smoke or drink and drive or things like that. But they really weren't health people, weren't doctors and nurses or allied health people. It was educators trying to work with teenagers and college kids. So it just never got to us. It never got to actual healthcare workers to use. And it's actually a good fit for us. So here's what the model looks like. So you have a belief. So here's her belief. She says, I can breastfeed my baby. That's her belief. Now I'm going to warn her, I'm going to tell her that a lot of women don't get to meet their breastfeeding goals. So I'm going to scare her a little bit, right? She's going to sit up and take notice, right? Oh, that could be me. That might not make my goal, right? And I'll tell you, when we did this study, that's exactly what I saw when they said that. They would sit up and, oh, that would be me. So their attention was piqued, right? They felt that little bit of a threat, okay, not a major threat, not a clobber threat, not a deadly threat, just a little bit. Just a little inoculation, just a little bit. So then, here's their reason. Everybody knows that pediatricians recommend babies for breastfeeding. Now, they can have other reasons, but that's an easy one. So here's the little myth. Here's the little lie. You should stop breastfeeding if you have the flu. So we know they don't stop breastfeeding if they have the flu, but that's the myth that's out there. So then we have to counter it. So this is the counter-attitudinal argument, right? That's trying to get her off of this. That's the threat, right? Forewarning and threat. And then we give her reasons. We give her logical reasons on why you breastfeed when you have the flu. Mother's milk carries important immune defenses to help protect her baby. And we give her another one because the more support we can give to her reason, the stronger her resistance will be. So we tell her withholding her milk during the time that she's ill is withholding that from the baby, and the baby could get sick. Right? So if it worked, she doesn't interrupt breastfeeding. She breastfeeds right through the flu. Right? That's how it should work. So we've got some vocabulary here. Persuasion, right? So that's that person who's trying to talk them into not breastfeeding, to interrupt breastfeeding or to stop breastfeeding or to give formula or whatever. but it's going against what the mom's intentions were. The mom intended to breastfeed. Usually they intend to exclusively breastfeed. So then we have the inoculation treatment, which is this model, right? And these are the pieces of it: a threat, and a counter attitude, and a reputational defense. And it looks like that got cut off, but that's what these are. Oops, the reputational defense. Okay. All right. So I had to look up to see how this was applied, so I would know how to make my intervention, how to conduct the experiment. So I had to do what's called a search of the literature to see who's done what with it in health. So I wanted to see what have we done on a health topic related to this theory, so I would know what I have to do. And I did this electronic database search. I don't know if you had to go in there, and you have like Cochrane is one of those databases, and you can look in and you can look in Cochrane and you can see there's like 200 and some odd breastfeeding studies, systematic reviews in Cochrane alone. So I looked in several, all of these places. These are big databases, huge databases. I think you probably have heard of Medline. Maybe you've heard of Medline. So I looked at all of those, and what I used for my key terms, I was looking for inoculation theory, which was the name of the theory, and I was looking for health. And you know, there weren't that many. I ended up with something like 46, and most of those were duplicates, or a lot of those were duplicates. And then I did another thing where we call it bibliographic mining. So this is another term we use in research. So you're actually looking at a study that looks good, that's in your range, and you're checking the reference list to see if there are any more studies in that reference list that might fit your bill. Then now with the internet, we have Google citation search. So if I put in one of those good articles, it'll tell me what other articles cited that. So it'll go forward for me. And you can look in that and see if there were any articles that actually might work for you. So I was able to add a few in. I had to take a few out. But then what I found was, because this theory's been around so long, people weren't really measuring the outcome. They were, because it's been so successful, they were pairing it up or bundling it with another intervention, and then I didn't have a way to know if the inoculation worked. So I didn't have a way to know that. So I ended up with very few studies. Five. That was it. 5 studies in health that fit that bill. So one of the DARE, have you ever heard of DARE? Everybody's heard of DARE. So they're kind of loosely based on inoculation, but they don't have that threat part. They don't have that part that makes her sit up and take notice. That's absent. So it doesn't really fit inoculation. There were a lot of research studies in the literature about that. So the studies that we had, this first one was about alcohol. And if you look up here, it tells me I had alcohol. It tells me who they were, so they were kids. They had a lot of them, and it tells me the type of research they're doing they had. It tells me how they operationalized the intervention, you know, how they did that little forewarning, counter-attitude, no message, rebuttal. So it tells me how it did those things, and it tells me what they were doing. And it tells me my outcomes, and check this out. There's that p-value. Whoops. It's p-value. That p-value. So if it's less than 0.05, it's significant, it counts. Now, sometimes it can count just a little bit or it can count a lot. These aren't telling you if it counts a little bit or it counts a lot. It just says it counts. The probability is highly probable that these are correct results. So that's what it's really telling you. It's looking at that p-value. So that's the first number. So we looked at that and we saw that additionally, when we do an inoculation treatment, if we were just looking at alcohol, we could also inoculate with another related behavior. And in this case, it was risky sex, because this next one was about college kids. So when we did the inoculation with that, it also made like an umbrella over this other risky behavior, right? So in terms of breastfeeding, that would be if we do this intervention, we can keep them from giving formula, but we can also probably keep them from giving tea or glucose water or other things. So it's telling us that it won't work just against formula, it'll work against other things, other types of supplements. So that was important for us to know. Then this, I'm going to move one more. Sazavo. What we found here was if they had already made a decision that they were going to smoke, or if they'd already made a decision that they were going to drink, and we did the inoculation treatment, it was going to boomerang, and it was going to commit them and entrench them to smoke. It was going to make them want to do it more. And we it's very Italian, I think. If you tell me I got to do it, I'm going to tell you I'm not. But it's called reactance. Reactance happens. So one of the most important things we have to do when we decide to use this theory is we have to know where these people stand. So if the mom's already made up her mind to use formula, that she's going to mix feed, I'm going to probably push her in the wrong direction with my inoculation treatment. Yeah, uh-oh. Ruh-roh. That's exactly what happened. And for some, so I'll show you how that works. Okay, so here we are. I've gone through all 5 studies, and there's my little one here at the end with no results to show you yet. So I had to look at that body of literature and make some decision about that body of literature, what the strengths were and what the weaknesses were before I designed my own study. So I could see that those 5 studies held to those constructs of the inoculation treatment, and I saw how they were measured, how they were operationalized, how they did it with either a video or maybe it was something that people had to read, or it might have been a computer message. There were a couple of different ways of doing it, but they did all those steps, all those pieces. Then I also they also tested to make sure that their people had the attitude they were looking for, that they already had that positive attitude. So they all had a little scale of some kind so that they could make that determination that these people already had this belief. And finally, they had to measure the inoculation treatment, right? So I needed to make sure that whatever else was in my study, that I had that outcome value there. But there were some real big holes in this literature too. So fidelity of implementation. So we need to know that when somebody does an experiment, that each group that this intervention is presented to, it's presented the same way. That there aren't some other differences in there. The script stays the same, right? Everything stays the same. And it's best if you have just 1 or 2 people doing the intervention, because maybe you have someone like me. I'm pretty outgoing, right? And like a cheerleader. I was a cheerleader, right? So, that kind of gets people enthusiastic about it. And then you might have someone like my husband who's rather taciturn and probably not as inviting and probably not as enthusiastic, and that person will get different results, right? So that's what we're talking about, fidelity of implementation. Sometimes it's the person presenting it, sometimes it's the pieces itself. But that was nowhere in those studies. Nobody mentioned that. I don't know who out of the 417 kids, what they saw, who brought it, or how they tested it. Those pieces were missing. So I needed to make sure that I did it the same way every time when I designed my study. Then they didn't measure the behavioral outcomes. They only measured attitudes. So if the inoculation treatment worked, all they showed was it made them think that it increased their intentions. There were no behavioral measures. Well, that's not going to help me. Attitude is nothing in the face of all the other things that our moms are getting tugged to do. So I knew it had to have behavioral measures. Did she not breastfeed? Did she not exclusively breastfeed? That's what I wanted to know. What actually happened? Did it actually change her behavior? And then it has to be this generalizability. So as you will see, my study lacked that. All of these studies lacked that. All of these studies were so young people, college age and adolescents, so we're only looking at this one little subgroup of people who are pretty, in some ways, malleable, more so than we would be as full-grown adults. They were also almost all Caucasian, right? So we didn't have any ethnicities. in any of this body of research. So do I know if this theory can apply to Hispanic moms? Right? I have no idea because they never looked at it. Nobody ever looked at that. Nobody ever evaluated it. Was it going to work somewhere other than Anglo-America? So those were some of the things that I had to think about before I did the study or the design. But I actually thought it could work. So I decided that I would do it as a game, and that would be a fun way to do it. I do it in a breastfeeding class because that's where my people are, right? We know that they form their attitude to breastfeed before they have the baby, actually before they get to breastfeeding class, to tell you the truth, which I will show you in the results. So I decided that it was doable, and proceeded to think that I could just line up my interventions and miss, and found out I couldn't do so. So that's actually the game. This is what it ended up looking like. I'm going to, you can download it on FLCA. You can just print it like a ledger size. This, like nothing to them.
Have we trademarked this?
Yeah. What?
Have we trademarked this?
No, I'm just going to give it to FLCA. That way everybody can have it, right? I mean, you're not going to make $1 million on this.
It would make a great fundraiser for FLCA.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if I can do that or not. I have to think about that. But you can just download it. You can take it to your local printer, have it laminated, and you've got the game. So what you see coming around, it was, I just bought some dice. I just bought some little glass things, and I made up the game. But it wasn't quite that simple. Okay. The actual construction of materials was way easy. The actual deciding what had to go into those materials, as Pat knows, because Pat had to help me. It was not so easy. So it had 3 phases. First, I had to know what were the myths that were out there. I had to know what were the most frequently encountered myths that were out there. So I thought, oh, piece of cake. Then I found out that wasn't so. So then I had to develop a survey to validate my myths, and then I finally got to develop the game. So this is what happened. And mind you, we're not even to the experiment yet. Okay? We're still trying to build the intervention. So what happened was I went to the scholarly literature, the empirical literature, the peer-reviewed literature, looking for this list of myths. Well, there is no such thing. What we have done is we were relying on Lisa Maracuzzo's list that we have in Lebanon, and we were looking at Jack Newman's list that he has up at the center. He's got, breastfeeding myths and more myths and all of that. And this one I love, Valerie Finnegan's book. Have you seen this? Saggy Boots and other. It's so cute. So she had a bunch of them in there, and none of these were empirically tested. So I had to test them first. I had to, what we call, validate these myths before I could do it. So that was, I don't know, those of you who were at the 2010, or was it 2008? Who was it, Bonnie, when I did the survey? 2010 it must have been. 2010. So Bonnie's twisted a few arms there and got everybody that was there to take the survey that I had to develop to validate the myths. And so all the people that attended the 2010 FLCA conference are the people who became the people who validated the myths that we have now. So, so at that time, so now this is descriptive. A survey is a descriptive research study. So inside of my big research study is the smaller descriptive study. So when we're talking about descriptive studies, for the most part, we're talking about, here's the statistic phrase, measures of central tendency and perhaps standard deviation from the center. So if you're thinking of your bell curve, right, the center of the bell curve, and then as it comes down, those are the deviations. How far can it deviate before it's no longer usable? That's what it's talking about. So what I did is I pulled this myth together. I did what's called thematic analysis. So I looked at the list from Jack, and I looked at the list from Lisa, and I looked at the list from Valerie, and I made them all up into an item, and I put them all lumped in piles until I had 30 piles. That's what it ended up being, 30 things that were pretty much the same, and made the survey. And that's how I did it. And then I put it on a page and forgot to tell everybody there was a backside to it. So if you do surveys, don't do backside, do 2 sheets, right? So I also asked some demographic backgrounds because I was aware that it might be that people from different practice settings or different backgrounds might hear different myths. So that's the reason these were up here. Most of the people, but not everybody, were IBCLCs, right? About 63%, right? We had a few CLCs. Half of the people were registered nurses. That year was the year they didn't do the funding for WIC, so WIC wasn't as well represented as it's been at other conferences. Usually we have a lot more WIC people, but I think it got cut off on this slide somehow, but there weren't that many WIC people, but they're there. It was like only a small amount of people from WIC, 21%, and they're usually almost the other half WIC, so normally. So we validated it. I now knew what the myths were, and here are the top 10. But there's something you have to understand about the myths. Myths perpetuate because there's a grain of distorted truth there. That's how they can perpetuate. Somewhere there's some twisted way that there's a small little bit of truth. So here it is, this first one, the one that we hear all the time, breastfed babies don't sleep, right? That's not true. What it is we're actually concerned about how much mom is sleeping, aren't we? That's what we're really caring about. We're caring about how much sleep mom is getting. And we know from the research that mom is getting 45 minutes more sleep than her formula-fed counterpart if she breastfeeds exclusively. So we know that. We know that from 11 different research studies. So that's the truth, that mom's going to get more sleep. But what they hear is the bottle-fed baby will sleep longer. So it makes it a little tough to diffuse that, and we'll talk about how that happens. The other thing is that people that can't tell that their baby is satiated, right? They don't know anything about normal breastfed baby behavior because we're not a normal breastfeeding culture. So how are they going to know? So they don't have their confidence. So they think that that's a problem. But you know how much the baby's getting. If the baby's pooing, the baby's getting food. If the baby's gaining, the baby's getting food. So no, you don't have ounce markers on your breast, but we know that the baby's getting enough food. So this one, breastfeeding is difficult. Well, there is a grain of truth in that, right? If you've never done, you remember learning how to drive a car? Okay, it's much harder to learn how to drive a car than it is to breastfeed. Okay. I found I learned on a regular car with an automatic transmission, and still, felt that was probably the most difficult skill I ever had to learn. So in comparison to that,
but you don't see women refusing to learn how to drive a car. They persevere because everybody does.
Yes, yes. So you're kind of seeing the way these things get framed, right? So here's the other thing, this regulation of infant feeding, right? Regulation of the milk supply. People have a very difficult time understanding that baby leads the feedings. It's, again, a problem of lack of understanding of the physiology behind human lactation and lack of understanding for normal infant behavior. So I could really see patterns in these things as they were coming through. So what I could see, though, was it was normal infant behavior. So Jane Henning's doing all that wonderful research and program on how women understand normal infant breastfeeding behavior. She's done some remarkable, great stuff in California about that. I can't think of the name of the program right now. And but what they need is education about sleep, and they need education about feeding adequacy. So they just need education. But there are maternal concerns for difficulty, and we kind of talked about that. Learning to swim, learning to drive, learning to breastfeed is a whole lot easier than those two things. Right? And it takes a whole lot less time to learn those two things. So those stable biological mechanism, come on. How could it not be a stable biological mechanism? We wouldn't be here. There was no formula 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or back in the cave days. Okay, it was just these. Okay, that's what we had, and it worked. Look at everybody here today. So you can, it's just absurd that this unstable biological mechanism has any weight at all. Any weight at all? How can that be? And I don't really have an explanation of how that can be.
Doctors say so.
Yeah, but it's all BS, right? I mean, there's absolutely no foundation for that one. I can't find the grain in that unstable biological mechanism. Where is the grain in that? And yet it persists, and I don't understand why. So it's very difficult to diffuse if you don't understand why it persists. So that's another research problem. So now I knew what the myths were. I knew what my top 4 issues were, but now I had to develop the intervention. I had to develop the threat portion of it, and I had to develop the defense. And that's where Pat and Annette came in. They were my expert panel. So after I realized what those myths were, I had to craft, if you look, this looks like a Monopoly card. That was the defense statement, the refutational defense. And then it looks kind of like a Monopoly chance card. That was their threat. So when they landed on chance, or they landed on the little piece of the game where they had to pick up a threat card, they had to choose. They had 4 defense cards. They had to choose the right defense card to bust the myth. So it took a lot to get that right, to get the wording to fit on a card, to be concise enough to diffuse about 3 myths. And what I did is I made the first run, and Pat and Annette did what's called a Q-sort, and they matched this pile of myths with what they thought the right defense was. And that's how it started. And then we did what we call a Delphi. So we talked or emailed back and forth round, and then I would make changes and send the next round of changes out, and they would return those changes to me. And it probably went back and forth maybe 4 or 5 rounds of the Delphi, and we finally had statements that work, and then my advisor got hold of them. Okay, so so then we had to go back, right? Because remember, my advisor knew nothing about breastfeeding. Never been a mommy, never breastfed, never knew anyone who breastfed, right? So, yeah. So God bless her for keeping on with me. But in any case, so we worked with that, and then we had it. Okay, we finally had the intervention, the actual inoculation treatment, the defense statements, and the myths. So we had it. That was the final phase of the development of that game, and probably the most labor-intensive to get that to be a good fit, because we had to know if people besides lactation consultants could match those up correctly. So I had college students at the time, so I beta tested it on them, and they could do it, so I figured if they could do it, young and dumb as they are, other moms could do it, so it worked. And we had to test to make sure that the timing was going to work. We had very little tiny space of time to be able to conduct the intervention during the breastfeeding class. So let's see. I don't know if that was one of the defenses or not, but the defense statements were, let's see. You should not breastfeed. You may have heard that there are many times when you should not breastfeed because something is wrong with the mother's milk. Right? And experts believe that there are actually very few times to interrupt breastfeeding. During illness, mother's milk delivers important disease-fighting factors to the newborn. Most medicines are safe to take when breastfeeding, even when moms don't eat healthy foods or even if they smoke. It is still better for the baby to be breastfed. And then the myth that challenged that was, you should not take medicines while breastfeeding. So that was one of the little myth cards. You should not breastfeed if you are sick, and you should not breastfeed if you smoke. So when they played the game, they had to diffuse those myths. They had to pick the card that was going to diffuse it so they could win. And when they played all 4 cards, that's how they won. And then they got little breastfeeding cookie recipes. They also got, I don't know where they went, little as a thank you gift, because I won that great big fat grant. So I found without breastfeeding and that happened because she's trying to get moms to just breastfeed their mothers. And I care about the kids. One mother, one mom. I don't have a kid because I still breastfeed. I know. I said, oh. No, I did that because the literature, Maya Bonnick said that would be a good gift to entice people to want to be in the study. So that's what I did, right? Thinking that was good, and it actually wasn't such a good thing. I probably should have come up with something else, but it is what it is. I did what I did. So that's what we did. And now we're ready to talk about the actual experiment. So we had to go through all of this to get there. And we had these objectives. We had primary objectives and secondary objectives. The primary objectives were to test a woman's self-efficacy, to resist persuasion to give formula. So that's an attitudinal one. Right? I was just going to measure if she thought she could say no to somebody that wanted her to give formula. Then the other primary objectives were her actual behaviors. So any breastfeeding in the hospital, exclusive breastfeeding in the hospital, any breastfeeding at 1 month, and exclusive breastfeeding at 1 month. So those were the behaviors I looked at. And I asked at the 1 month only for the 24-hour period passed. So I wasn't asking her to remember what she did, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. I only asked her what she did in the last 24 hours. The secondary objective that I had was to ask her why she supplemented. And I had a checklist of reasons, that came from the literature, and what the most likely things. I didn't have enough milk, my nipples were sore, breasts were sore, things like that. So that was the secondary objective, and that was ended with some open-ended questions. So I have a lot of really good data, and all of those were recorded. So
when you're saying supplementation, you mean formula?
No, because we explained the definition. We used the definition anything other than mother's milk. So if they told me if the baby had a pacifier dipped in sucrose on the circuit board, right? So I needed to know. I needed to know what happened in the hospital. Did the baby get anything in the hospital? So they were pretty good. I think pretty good about it. The way Annette was really brilliant interviewing these moms, because she was a working lactation consultant and I was no longer a working lactation consultant, so I was at a bit of a disadvantage. I hadn't really been counseling mothers full time for a couple of years by then. So, but it was so fun. It was so fun talking to them, but also a little surprising at some of the answers that they had. So in any case, I had my objectives. So because this was quantitative, these are actual research hypotheses that I had to prove and disprove, and they're a little bit wordy, but for example, hypothesis 4, the intervention group will have a higher likelihood of breastfeeding exclusively in the hospital while controlling for maternal intention to breastfeed than the members of the person group. Okay, so you can see that they're a little wordy, but the objectives were the same. I needed to know what the behaviors and if the intervention increased those breastfeeding behaviors. And that's what I was looking for. Okay, so now this is what you need to know about experimental and quasi-experimental research designs. And these would be pretty fair questions on the FLCA exam. So you have randomization and you have allocation. So hear this word randomized controlled trial. So randomized controlled trials are pretty hard to do in breastfeeding, right? I mean, we don't have very many of those. What do we have? The Kramer studies, over there in Belarus. We don't have very many because it's not really ethical to say you can't breastfeed and you can, right? So it makes it a little difficult for us to do randomized controlled trials. And in my case, because the game was so novel, it would get people talking about it, right? So they all go through, you know how they go through their parenting classes together? So they're taking Lamaze classes together, and they're taking parenting classes together and sibling classes together. Well, if they take the breastfeeding class and they had the game and somebody else didn't, that would be a bias, right? It would contaminate, it would diffuse the nature of the intervention to the comparison group. It would contaminate my comparison group. So I could only do a quasi-experimental study. So I was not able to randomize. But I did the next best thing, and I just took the first bunch of people that came through, and they were the comparison, and when I thought we had enough people, then we started the intervention. That way, I didn't have that bias, that people didn't know about the game. So bias is a big problem in a lot of our literature, and that we really have to control for it. So down at the bottom, you see this where it says allocation. Allocation, so instead of being randomized, just allocation. So the first 12 groups that came through were comparison and the rest were intervention, is what I did. So then they had this little X, that's the intervention. So one group got the intervention and one group did not. So one X and none and no X. But both groups were observed twice. So actually, we got some baseline on their intentions, so you could almost say 3, but we observed them post-test. That's the word, post-test. Post-test. So we observed them at 2 weeks, and that's when we measured their self-efficacy, their attitude. And then we observed them at 1 month. And these were not direct observation, they're telephone surveys that we conducted. After they had the baby, 1 month after. So the first one happened at 2 weeks, and after the intervention, and we measured attitude, self-efficacy. And the second one happened when the baby was about a month old, you know, still in the puerperium, but about a month old. So once we had all of this designed, we knew what we wanted to test for. Now we had to get IRB, because it's human research subject. It has to go through the institutional review board. Every big hospital has its own. Smaller hospitals will farm it out, consult it out, whatever. But they have to be sure that my experiment isn't going to hurt anybody. That's what their purpose is, to protect the people involved in the study from harm. Right? So they look at my design and my methods, and they determine whether or not my people are at risk for that. The people in the study have certain rights, and they have to be sure that I have stood by their rights and haven't abused their rights. And one of those rights, a really important one, is informed consent. You hear that a lot, informed consent. So they had to know that they were in a study, and I had to get their permission. So I had to have informed consent. I had to have their permission to follow them up. So everybody who came into the class actually played the game or watched the video, but I only followed up people who gave me permission. And because it didn't work here at Winnie, I had to transport these documents that had personal information on them, telephone, name, things like that. Oops, sorry. It's telling me I should be on time. Go over my time. So it's telling me that I had to make sure that that information doesn't fall into enemy hands or marketing hands, right? So I had to have a fireproof, impact-resistant, secure document transporter. Think James Bond, attaché case. The screens mug me. But actually, I found something that worked, and it looked just like somebody who was bringing their creative memory stuff around. And it had a pin lock, and it was fire retardant, and if I got in an accident, the papers wouldn't end up all over the highway. Right? They would stay intact in the carrier. So that worked, but I also had to be able to get this information back and forth between Annette and myself. So we had to have an encrypted flash drive, and it had a padlock on it. So you had to put the little code in on it. I don't know if you could see the little buttons on there. So you had to punch in the correct code, and you had so many seconds to get it into the drive and open after you put in the code. So we had 2 of them so that we could do the data back and forth, right? So she would be interviewing moms, I'm interviewing moms, and I would update her from what we did, and that's how it went on for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, almost a year by the time we were done. So it went on a long time, and but they were actually pretty good. I would say IRB, they're pretty tough cookies. If you ever have to deal with them, they're rough. They, in the end, smacked my hands good, said I was a bad girl, and I'll tell you why. But yeah, I was mortified. I thought I was being such a good girl too. But they're really hard. They're not researchers themselves. They are gatekeepers, and they are protecting those moms. That's their job, protecting them from me of using them. Right, as a researcher. So here we are. We're at beautiful Winnie Palmer Hospital, where there are 14,000+ deliveries a year, so I knew I could recruit my subjects pretty fast, or that was what my hope was. So here's where we had to make some inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? Who can be in the study and who cannot be in the study. And I'm here to tell you, I will never do a study this way again. I will only do pragmatic studies. Everybody's in. Because my committee talked me into excluding women. Well, you cannot tell somebody who's pregnant in a class that she can't play, and everybody else can. Oh, no. Oh, they looked at me like I was the most evil thing on the face of this earth. But tears in her eyes, wet eyes. Her husband looked at me like I'm rotten. The women next to her are looking at. I recruited 5 people out of that 20 because I did it so wrong. So I said right then, right there, so everybody who wants to be in the study can be in the study. I will never, ever tell someone they can't play again. That's wrong. You can't do that. You can't do that.
Maybe you could have allowed them all to play, but then the results would be only the ones.
Yes, that's exactly what we did. We could, in the end, I said, well, we won't be able to use all of the data that you give us if you're a little early, but everything you give us will be important. Okay? That's how we had to do it. But I'll tell you what a lesson that was. I felt awful, and I forget the young educator that was with me. We both looked at each other and thought, we're not criminals here. So we changed that tune right fast. But we had to recruit 160 women for the statistical analysis to have enough power to tell us something. And we anticipated that, we would lose a good 25% one way or another. So we wanted to over-recruit. Plus, they had me do this if they didn't come with somebody. If they came unaccompanied, I couldn't include them in the research. And that was not my idea, okay? That was my committee's idea. I knew better. But you're powerless in your dissertation. It's your committee's dissertation. So I had to have that in there. So here we are at the end of the recruitment period, and I don't have the numbers, right? And I'm not going to get the numbers because at least 25% of these women come alone, right? Maybe more. This depends on the time of year, like close to Christmas. Dad's at one other function, and they're coming here, and that's what happened. We ran into Christmas. So if they didn't speak English, they were out of luck because I didn't speak Spanish unless there was, a translator there, so we couldn't include them. But we didn't really have that issue. Everybody was pretty homogenized. They had to have a phone. Otherwise, they had to be expecting a healthy baby. That was the criteria. But to tell you the truth, a lot of these moms, even if their babies ended up in the NICU, they still breastfed. And they still got that milk to that baby and did everything they could to see that their baby got only mother's milk. So I would never make that an exclusion criteria again. I might look at it as a separate piece of data, but I would exclude nobody. Pragmatic trial. It's the only thing I'll ever do again. Won't do that. Make that mistake. Okay. So if you remember when we were looking at the barriers, I don't know if I can do that here. I had to know what might confound my results. So I had to make sure that I asked questions so I knew, did she have a baby before and breastfeed? Did her mother breastfeed? Did somebody she know close to her breastfed? These are the factors that I know. Is she going back to work? Those were the things that were going to make up the survey that I have to control for. So I know a woman who is younger than 25 years of age is less likely to breastfeed and less likely to breast exclusively than a woman who is over 25 years of age, right? So those things had to be considered as I made my intake form. So we had some surveys, and we had some instruments. So the first survey was the maternal characteristics. Single, married, widowed, divorced, or separated. No, it wasn't like that. Actually, I didn't do that. We used accompanied as a surrogate for that, which was a mistake. But in any case, we had to ask her, what's your age? Did someone close to you breastfeed? Have you had any previous breastfeeding experience? We asked for her education level. So we asked her if she'd finished high school, if she had some college, if she'd finished college, if she had a graduate degree. We looked at that because we know that's important. We asked her what her family income was. That ended up not being important. But, education, right? And education really trumps money. So that really was a loud thing. So we had that. Then we were looking at the breastfeeding behaviors. So we were asking her, in the last 24 hours, did your baby receive anything other than mother's milk? It's a pretty simple question. You just got to think in the last. And then we asked her, is this a typical 24 hours? And one woman said, no, usually I just breastfeed, but I wanted to go to the state fair. So we breastfed her baby that whole time and then wanted to go to the fair and gave him formula. Like, well, what are you thinking? But she was young. So, and then we had the last little part was a little checklist on why they supplemented or why they weaned. So, let's see. Now, instruments, though, now we're back into some more statistics. This is another kind of statistics called psychometrics, and we needed to know if the scales we were using were worthwhile, if they were really measuring what we thought they were measuring, right? If they were looking at that one particular trait, maternal intention to breastfeed, or her confidence in her ability to say no to someone without using formula. So the statistic that you probably need to know is this Cronbach's alpha. Let's see where that is. Right there. Cronbach's alpha, and you'll see it like a little A. And the number you want is 7 or more. My scale only had 6 items. So, one scale had a 6.4. That was actually okay because it was such a small scale. My breastfeeding survey myths that I gave to the lactation consultants with the 30 items, it had 90. It came up at 0.9 because there were so many items. So you have to weigh the Cronbach's alpha somewhat judiciously on how many items are in the scale. But generally, 7 and 8 are the numbers you want. 0.7 or 0.8 Cronbach's alpha tells you the scale measured what it was supposed to measure, essentially. And it's not the best by far. Okay, it's like the least amount you have to do to ensure consistency. That's the lowest thing you do. There's so many other more, and I know Ruth probably, because I know you've heard some people present at Winnie, so, that people that actually develop and test scales, there are much more rigorous tests for that. But for your purposes, for my purposes, you just need to know about that alpha, Cronbach's alpha, and if it's a 7 or an 8, we're real happy. And if it's a little bitty scale and we got a 6, it's good enough. If it's a great big scale and we got a 9, who cares? It's not gonna, it just means there are too many items in the scale. So I had these two scales. The maternal intention to breastfeed scale actually measured if she wanted to breastfeed or if she wanted to formula feed. And so it asked her, when you're in the hospital, how likely are you to breastfeed your baby? And it was on a 1 to 5. And then it turned around and asked, when you were in the hospital, how likely are you to formula feed your baby? Same thing. Gave a 1 to 5 answer. So at the end of that, I would sum that. It was a possible 30. That would be the highest they could get. And that ended up being a good scale. Ended up being a really good scale. As little as it was a good scale and probably something other people can use because it tells us who's at risk to formula feed that baby. Because they're already intending to do it, and then we need to know that because then my intervention's not going to work. Right? It's going to boomerang. So then the self-efficacy scale, it has things like, let's see, when you were in the hospital and the nurse says that she's going to take the baby into the nursery for the night so you can get your sleep, how sure are you that you could tell her no? So that's how that scale worked. And we had something with a relative who wanted to breastfeed the baby. We had when the doctor was giving you formula packs. We had 6 things that were fairly common. It wasn't that great a scale, but for this population, it might work in another population. It just wasn't all that great in this population. So here was our schedule. We were getting those baseline measures just before they came into the class. So I was standing outside the class door, and as they were lining up, they were taking their survey and going in the door. Right? So I knew before they had their class what their intentions were. So that the class can change their mind, right? Increase their intention or decrease their intention. The class itself is a good thing to help increase their intention to breastfeed and decrease their intention to formulate. So I needed to know the measure before they got that, right? So we did that. Then I called them 2 weeks after they had the class, roughly 2 weeks after they had the class, and found out, the self-efficacy scale. How sure are you that you could tell that nurse no? So we did that. And then after they had their baby, they sent me these little postcards when they had their baby. And it just said special day. And they just had to put the day and they just had to put the month and the day, not the year. They just had to fill that in. It just said very important day. So I knew she had her baby, and I knew to call her. Right? So it was really lovely to get all those postcards back from those moms who wanted to tell me they had their babies. So it was surprising how happy they were to be part of this study. They really enjoyed it. Plus, I think they also knew they were going to get to talk to a lactation consultant in a month out. So they were going to get that free 1 month thing. So that's how the timing worked. And we actually held to that pretty well. We didn't have too much trouble meeting that time thing. So here's, we recruited from July to December. So for 6 months, I schlepped the table, the stand, the baby dolls, all this stuff back and forth to Winnie once or twice a week to recruit. So it was a long haul. And then some women come really early to the breastfeeding class. The last mom finished Mother's Day weekend. So, I mean, it was, she must have been like 3 months pregnant when she came to the class. But it took forever to get the last of the data. And at that time, because the participants didn't know if they were getting the intervention or they were in the comparison group, that's called deception. So I had to do a debriefing letter to let them know which group they were in. And I couldn't send that out until the last person was done. So it went on for a long time. But we had a great big study. So we had 430 women come to the class. We actually had 302 women finish the study. We had 372 who said they wanted to be in it, and they dropped out. Maybe 50 or 60 of them dropped out for this reason or that reason. So you have to, in a controlled trial, you have to say what happened to these people. You have to say, I asked this many people. This many people said no. This many people said no in the intervention group. This many people got lost, and that many people got lost. And then because I was silly and had inclusion-exclusion criteria, I had to write out what happened here, but I have all their data. Anybody that finished the study, I have all their data. I kept everything. But I could only report on the people that met the criteria, the 267. So it actually was a huge study. It was a really, really big study. So we have sufficient numbers now. One of the things that has to happen at this stage, once the data is in, we have to do something that's called data cleaning. So we have to make sure that the data is accurate. So my friend and I went through it one by one and checked the data I put into my program, my statistic analysis program, was the same data that the mom had filled out on her forms and that had filled out on her forms. So we had to check those, every single blessed one of them, 302 of them. And then we also had to look to see if there was any data that was missing. And the data that was missing, in order to do certain statistical procedures, we had to make some decisions on how we wanted to handle that. And I will tell you that that is the lion's share of data analysis, is data cleaning. So if you're going to do a study, You plan that the largest part of your time is actually happening at this data cleaning stage. Running the numbers and interpreting the numbers was pretty fast by comparison. Data cleaning is what took a lot of time and a lot of decisions had to be made regarding this data. So just those of you who are headed that way, you need to know that. And if you don't clean the data, your results are worthless. So you must do it, and there's certain things you have to show in writing that you did, that you took care of these potential issues that could throw off your results. So for the most part, I had such a homogeneous group of people. They were 80% of them college educated. Right? 80% of them had a college education. Most of them were over 30. They were affluent, right? And they were white. Most of them were white, like 68% were Anglo, European descent. Most of them came with their hubby, or their significant other. So let's see if I can get there. Okay. So the first part of the data now, I think I missed a slide. Nope, I guess not. I had to compare maternal characteristics, and I see that slide is missing. I had to look to see the people who dropped out of the study, were they different from the people who finished the study in any significant way? Were they older? Were they younger? Were they richer? Were they poorer? Were they this? Were they that? I had to look at that and make sure, because in many controlled trials, people will drop out if things get too hard, right? So I had to look and see if they were essentially the same between groups. I also had to look to see if they were the same between comparison group and intervention group. Did everybody, 80% of the intervention people have a college education and 80% of the comparison have a college education? So I had to look at those factors that affect breastfeeding rates and make sure they were the same or roughly the same in both groups. So that's what had to happen. And they were, so we didn't really have any problems with that. So here was the result of the first hypothesis, which, could they say no? Well, let me tell you, they all thought they could say no. So here, this first one, the dotted line was the slope for the intervention group, and the solid line was the slope for the comparison group. Is there much difference between those two lines? No. No, there's virtually no difference between those lines. So this, where we are, p-value, it's no big deal. It doesn't mean anything. It's not significant. There were no significant differences between groups because the p-value told me that, but I could see it in my data. I could see it in my output. So what actually happened, out of a score of 30, they scored 28.18 and 28.39 between the two groups. So they all thought that they could do this. They all thought that they had the confidence. And it makes sense because 80% of them were college-educated women. You know that college-educated women met Healthy People 2010 goals. They'll probably need Healthy People 2020 goals too for breastfeeding. College-educated women. So what we call that, if you can see how everything's bunched up there at the corner, ceiling effects. Ceiling effect. So there might be a statistical study that or a statistical procedure I could use that might be able to help me separate that out, but it's called item response theory, and I'm not going there. So what it is what it is. So the next thing we had to look at, here's what happened. 100%, everybody in the study breastfed. Everybody breastfed. Didn't matter what group they were in, 100%. So that's who's coming to our breastfeeding classes. 100% are going to breastfeed, right? So then we looked to see who was breastfeeding in a month, and it was 96% and 94%. Almost everybody was still breastfeeding in a month. So yeah, so they were an unusual group, right? Whether they were in the comparison group or the intervention group, they all breastfed. Everybody breastfed. So the only real variables I had to look at was exclusivity. So I could see that there was some difference in exclusivity. And that was really all I had to go with. So those first of those primary things on any breastfeeding and any breastfeeding in a month, I had nothing to say. They were just exemplary moms. They all breastfed. So I had nothing to say there. And if you look at that time, the Florida rates were 74% then, and we had 100%. 70%, we had 96%. They're changing these exclusive breastfeeding things, right? Yeah, because we knew that wasn't true. There was no way they were 56% exclusively breastfeeding. in the hospital. But that's what the numbers were coming up. But we know that wasn't true at that time. I don't know if it's true now. I'm not there, so I don't know. But and I don't think so. But okay, so now we're looking at exclusively breastfed in the hospital. So my intervention didn't work. It didn't make a darn bit of difference whether they whether they were in the intervention group or in the control group and exclusive breastfeeding in the hospital. Didn't make any difference. What did make a difference, though, was the delivery type. Can you see that significance there? These are p-values. That's the row of p-values. So wherever you see the p less than 0.05, that's significant, right? So delivery type was hugely significant. It was less than 0.0001. It was really highly significant. But I'll talk about why that happened. So we know that vaginal deliveries are more likely to breastfeed than cesarean deliveries. So this study bore that out. We know that there's a difference in ethnicity with exclusive breastfeeding. We know that Hispanic moms tend to initiate breastfeeding, but they're very rarely, not very rarely anymore, but were rarely at that time likely to exclusively breastfeed. So there's a difference in ethnicity. So I either had, I actually had it separated out, so I knew who was African American, I knew who was Hispanic, and Hispanic is such a big group. You really almost can't say that. So in the end, my committee had me throw everything together, and we looked at, Anglo-European and everybody else. That's kind of what we looked at. So either you were, a white Anglo kind of person, non-Hispanic kind of person, or you were everything else. So ethnicity was significant. Maternal intention to breastfeed was barely significant, barely. By the time these other factors were controlled for, delivery type and ethnicity, her intention to breastfeed really wasn't a whole hell of beans. It really wasn't that big a deal. It was significant, but this is where we're talking about, is it a little bit or a lot? So we're talking about magnitude here. And if you look, that little number right there, that tells me it was only 11% difference between the mothers who had a higher intention to breastfeed and the lower intention to breastfeed. So it wasn't a big difference, a little bitty difference. But if you're talking 1,000 moms, that's 100 moms who breastfed. It wouldn't have, right? I could pick it out. So these are the predictors: delivery type, ethnicity, and maternal intention to breastfeed. And here's a really interesting one. Down here, see where it says that delivery times ethnicity? That's called an interaction effect. So what I had here was if the mom was white Anglo, non-Hispanic, and she delivered vaginally, she was way more likely to have exclusively breastfed in the hospital than anybody else. However, that same white Anglo mom, if she had a cesarean section, she was actually 30% less likely to exclusively breastfeed than everybody else. So, but I'll tell you what was going on at that time. So I have to view those results with a little bit of caution. I'll tell you why when we get a little bit further along. So let's see. Oh, come on. All right, so you can now see all these numbers, but that's a logistic regression equation, right? So what it did is it took these beta coefficients and you put them all together, and at the end you get a certain number, and it's telling you whether the model itself, that group, was statistically significant, and it was. It was very, very nice model. Because there, look, can you see that? What's that number I'm concerned about right there? Yeah, that's what it told me. My model was good. It was a good model. It wasn't great because the number's kind of small, but it was a good model. So there it is, 3.6 times fold increase for white Anglo for vaginal, 33% increase for cesarean, decrease for cesarean. So when we're looking at the vaginal delivery, we had a 4.5-fold increase for vaginal deliveries across the board. But I think that might be a bit deceptive. I know it's there. I know that is likely that the vaginal delivery exclusively breastfed, but I don't think it was that big. That 4.5, that's a big number. I don't think it was really that big, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. If they were non-Hispanic, if they were Anglo, they were 3.6-fold more likely. So let's see. So now let's look at the 1 month, maybe. So please don't run out. Okay. So the treatment group assignment didn't matter in this one either. It didn't matter whether they were in the comparison group or the intervention group, except by ethnicity. So I'll explain that. First, if they had an education greater than 4 years, if they had a baccalaureate degree, see that there's the p-value for education, highly significant. There's the p-value for ethnicity, highly significant. But the big whopper number there was this: if they exclusively breastfed in the hospital, they would be exclusively breastfeeding a month. We know that, right? So the things that we thought we knew were proved out in this study, right? So if she exclusively breastfed in the hospital, she's much more likely exclusively breastfeeding at a month. So we got that. We got that Anglos are probably more likely than anyone else to exclusively breastfeed. We got that. And we got that 80% of women with a college education were exclusively breastfeed. We got that. But what happened here is they went in opposite directions. That's how the number went big. So if she was Anglo and she was in the intervention group, her rates decreased, boomeranged, right? And I could look at her intention to breastfeed, and if she intended to formula feed and breastfeed, she was the one who was going to react, right? So that's what happened. I had reactants, which, I mean, you don't want it, but it's just really cool. As a researcher, just to have that that thing happen, that's really interesting, because we said it could happen, and by golly, it did. It happened just the way they said. The women that had the intention to use formula and mixed feed felt that their personal freedom of choice was being impinged upon by my intervention, and so they reacted. They dug in, and they're going to formula feed no matter what. Right? Do that mixed feeding, and that's what happened. But interestingly enough, if they were from any other ethnicity, but especially Hispanic moms, and I'll show you how big that was, it improved their breastfeeding exclusivity rates. It really helped them along. So let's see if I've got it spelled out here. So if they were, look at this, white non-Hispanic decreased by 1/2, 0.45. Pretty big decrease. If they were anything other, it increased 3.6-fold. So that was a pretty big increase, right? So they went in opposite directions. So I have to be, when we use this intervention, we either need to get to these people before they make their decision, or we need to not do that intervention with them because we're going to induce reactants and they're going to buck this intervention and they're going to go against it. But it worked really well for every other mom, and especially for Hispanic moms. And in Central Florida, what did Regina say? Regina did hers, and she said we were 50% Puerto Rican in Central Florida. So 50 of the Hispanic moms that were in my study, half of them at least were Puerto Rican, and they have very low exclusive breastfeeding rates. Those of you who work with them. So there's that college education, 5-fold increase exclusively, 5.3, and Caucasian, whatever, over everybody else. And there it is, that maternal intention to breastfeed again was only 13%, but I have reasons to think why that might happen. So there's the logistic regression equation, and here's amazing, I actually know what that means. I know what that means. It's looking at my beta coefficients. And I wish I could show you, but I'm not going to do that, torture you like that. But I do know what it all means. It's amazing. Oh. Okay, so we're looking here at that secondary objective, reasons for supplementation or weaning. So we only had a few people wean, and it was interesting to me those that weaned, out of the handful of them that weaned, they reported that they never experienced lactogenesis 2. They never felt that breast fullness, or it was greatly delayed. It was like a week out. I had a couple that were like a week out. I would have to go back and look at the tapes to remember. I know we explored why that might be, and it would be on the recording, but I don't remember why. Usually we're thinking gestational diabetes because they seem to be the one most likely to have the delay. But there might be moms on egg sulfate too might be delayed. So we know we have a couple of reasons, but that's why they weaned by a month, because they just didn't have the supply, and that probably was, I would say, probably so. But women were supplementing because they perceived they didn't have the supply. right? They truly didn't understand the baby's behaviors. So they were talking here in the hospital. It's a little bit different than what we found at 1 month. In the hospital, if the mother or the baby were sick, so that meant if the baby was jaundiced or if mom had any clots. I mean, so their perception of what was sick wasn't necessarily a medical indication of sick that would interfere with breastfeeding. But that tells me, though, once that baby gets that label of jaundice, now they've got a sick baby. They got a sick baby. They don't have a sick baby, but they think they have a sick baby. So that was one of the reasons they cited. So interestingly enough, the pain in breast and nipples was never really a big deal. So they were doing a really good job with whatever they're doing in Winnie. They didn't have a lot of nipple trauma and complaints about that, so they were getting that right. I dummied up here on this prepare to work or school, wrong question. I dummied up here on this someone discouraged you, wrong question. What I should have asked here was when are you going back to work? That was the question I needed to ask. When? Because their perception of whether it's a problem or not does not jive with when they're going back. So here's the thing about the college education. So if she's a college-educated woman and she has an executive job, she probably has 3 months maternity leave. It's probably paid. She probably has an office where she can pump. So she has a lot of things that are going to support her continuing to breastfeed. But if she's working at McDonald's, she doesn't. She's going back in maybe 3 weeks or maybe 6 weeks. There's no maternity leave and no place to collect milk. So that education probably makes a big difference in the length of maternity leave and their exclusivity. So we really probably need to take a look at that. I know other people are looking at it, but I didn't think about it at the time. So I learned. This last one I just keep kicking myself for. That was so the wrong question. All I really needed to ask is somebody tell you to formula feed the baby. Did somebody encourage you or tell you? Not discourage you. But it should have been, did somebody tell you? Because I can't tell you how many said the doctor said I needed to, the nurse said I needed to, my mother said I needed to. Right? That's what I needed to know, and I didn't ask the right question. So that's what dissertations are for. You make your mistakes. So we did not confirm my primary objectives or any of them. We had some main effects that were interesting. This is what I wanted to show, what happened with our Hispanic moms, and this is why this needs to be looked at. So here's the reactants that happened. We had 80% exclusively breastfeeding in those Anglos, 28.6 in the Hispanic, and both of these, this number is a little high. The reason that number is a little high is Winnie Palmer, at the time I began this study, began their skin-to-skin protocol. They implemented it at that time and were really gangbusters doing that, and that's what increased those vaginal breastfeeding rates. They didn't do it for the C-section moms at that time. It just did the vaginal rates. So that's why I think that disparity is so great, because all these women, especially in the comparison group, when they were just implementing it and everybody's making their checks and making sure that all nurses are doing what they're supposed to do, and you know 3 months later they weren't doing it, right? So yeah, that it would slack, because unless you're doing an audit and checking up on them, it's going to slip back to the way it was. You have to have some kind of active way to keep doing that and checking that it's doing it and that the nurses are doing it and it's documented that they're doing it. So at that time they didn't have that in place, so I could see that it was falling down over time. But what happened with the Hispanic moms, look at how well that worked for them. They went from 28 to 68, just like everybody else. So it really had an effect for them.
You should only use it for them.
No, I think it was more. I actually think what needs to happen is it needs to be an app that they can download on their phone when they first hear they're pregnant. Okay, and they could, and one of the people in my study, her husband works at Full Sail University, and he loved that we did this as a game, right? He came up to me and goes, "Can you take a little critique?" And I said, "Sure." So he told me what he did, and he explained it. He said, if you make this game on a phone, and they can download it, and every time they play the game, they get to collect something, because they're nesting. I just loved it. He was so sensitive. They're nesting, so if they could collect a stroller, or they could collect a crib, and they could start collecting things, they'll be more interested in playing the game. Oh, he's so right. He's so right. He was so right, and that because we're taking advantage of that nesting and we're doing it early before they have formed the idea to formula feed.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So that would be, I mean, it's a perfect thing to do. So that's what I think needs to happen. Now, for our WIC moms, they're not as likely to form their decision as early as our Anglo moms. Okay? They tend to be younger, they tend to be less well educated, and they don't have the same obsessive compulsive desire to search out all the literature and look at every single possible website to make their decision, right? You know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
Right? So that's what I think might have happened there. So we just, and Winnie's already done this, we just need to mitigate the factors that are causing this interference with our C-section moms. And I know Winnie started doing their skin to skin for C-section moms. And when Raylene Phillips was here, I know she has that beautiful video that she did with who shall not be named and daughter. And they showed C-section moms, doing skin-to-skin in the delivery room, and they have the evidence that shows, and we've seen multiple studies that show that when we do it, it improves their breastfeeding rates. And we know we want them to exclusively breastfeed in the hospital. By God, we need them to do that because that's the biggest predictor of who's going to be exclusively breastfeeding on down the road. So if we get them started right in the hospital, they have a really good chance of continuing it. So I still don't, I think I have a fairly good idea of what happened in the Anglo moms. When I first crafted this, I didn't, but when I looked back to see who was going to formula feed, who had that intention, that's how I realized I induced reactance, so which is why I'm saying for them, they need the phone app, and it needs to happen early, as soon as they know they're pregnant.
Could it also have something to do with the age disparity between the instructor, you, and your mother?
My research, the people who were actually conducting the class were young.
Oh.
So, yeah, I just did the intervention part. Yeah, I didn't think that, yeah. Well, she's right. They don't want to hear it from an old lady.
Right, exactly.
They want a contemporary.
Right.
Yeah, when they're in trouble, then they want me.
Yes, yes.
Then they want grandma. When they're in trouble, they want grandma.
Right.
Right? Yeah,
but they don't want an old woman telling them what
so, yeah, and that was it, which is why I didn't teach the class.
Okay.
I only conducted the intervention. No, I did not teach the class. I had educators that routinely taught the class. That's who did it.
Oh.
And I just stepped in for my 30 minutes to do the game and get the paper signed, blah, 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 pass out the little gifts and stuff. And then I helped her. It was her assistant after that. So it was fun. So I did that. I would say that that the guy that from Full Sail, as soon as I graduate, I'm going to find him. He gave me his card and permission to call him. I think that's what needs to happen. And I think that the FDA would probably be willing to do that, Food and Drug Administration, on the WIC end. That's because they've been getting lots of money for stuff for breastfeeding right now, so that might be the place to go. And then, but I won't develop it without my consultants, okay?
I was going to say CDC.
Well, it depends on who's got the money.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's because it's going to be, you have to pay these people to develop the game, right? I have to pay someone to check my statistics, right? I mean, I'll do my own statistics, but I still want a second opinion on anything I do because I'm not a statistician, although I'm pretty good. Got much better.
Other question, Candace, is you talked about enrolling these women. They knew. Were they planning to take a breastfeeding class? Was it advertised as a breastfeeding
they were
class?
coming to a class. They didn't know that I was going to be there.
But I mean, were they already planning to take a breastfeeding course?
Yes.
Or was it your?
They didn't meet me till they'd already signed up for the. They didn't know anything about me.
Okay, so
they'd already
planned
booked.
to take a breastfeeding course, so it wasn't like they were encouraged or.
Nope. They had already, so they all, that's why.
They had the mindset, they wanted to learn more about breastfeeding, but they still came with that idea of, but I'm with that class because I want to know more about breastfeeding and bottle feeding. That's what they were really coming for, and that's not what they got.
I would say this group, these people, these 80% college-educated women, just put that woman in your mind, and she's 30, she's had a successful career, she's got all the money she needs. Maybe she's IVF even, so,
Yeah.
You know, you're thinking of that person who's had a lot of control over their life.
Right.
They've already made their decisions before they get to the breastfeeding class. So they don't even need to go, right?
Right. This is my
You know?
question.
Yeah,
Why
they
did
don't,
take
but that's
the
who
class?
goes.
Why did they
But
take
that's
the
who
class if they
goes
already know what they
because
wanted to do?
they are diligent.
Yes, they want to know how to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
not what they got. They got somebody telling them to resist
Oh, yeah, only
the temptation of the
Yes.
formula feeding.
Yeah, so those that had already decided that they were going to formula feed were not happy with the intervention.
Right.
Because don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up. Right? That's
Don't confuse me with the facts.
So I mean, that's real. They'd already made their decision. They'd already made their educated decision against, all of the things that are going on in their life, and they're in the best position to make that. I just needed to get to them much sooner.
Like when they're 12?
No, early in the pregnancy, right when they first find out that they're pregnant and they start thinking baby dreams, and they can download this cool app.
You can start when they're young.
No, I want to develop it. I want to do it before the formula companies do. So one of the things that I found kind of disturbing as we went through this, there were more myths that come out. So the formula company is still doing this. So when I first started this study, I didn't know anything about reflux formula, but everybody's heard of reflux formula now, right? What the heck is that? How can you sit up? What is that? Yes, there's reflux, but just because your baby sits up doesn't mean you need a reflux formula. But yeah, so there's a new myth. So whatever, we may have isolated some of the most frequent things. It needs to be done again. It needs to be nationwide. We need to know what's happening in, what is the formula mime in the Northeast, what are moms being told in the Southeast, what's happening inside of my Mexican population. I need to know and be able to diffuse things to the target population, right? So, and we need to keep a step ahead of the formula companies. I had no idea this reflux formula. So we're talking, I was doing these calls in 2012. Now we have like 9 reflux formulas out there, right? I think 9 reflux formulas. What the heck?
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Right?
Absolutely.
Formula breastfeeding babies.
Right. So those are, so the myths I took from Val's were probably the most recent evaluation of the myths. Her list was the most recent, but we really need to take what we did here as in the 2010 conference, and we need to put out on SurveyMonkey and get it from different regions of the country and from people from different practice settings and backgrounds. And we also need to know how long they've been in practice, because some of the things from Lisa Maracuzzo's myths were in the Baby Wise days, when that was a huge threat to our breastfeeding mothers. It's less so now. And we had that, those of us who have been in practice a long time, and saw those babies and what was going on, that just stays big in our mind. But somebody who's only been in practice maybe the last 3 or 4 years doesn't have that. So I really need to know how long they've been practicing as a lactation consultant. Maybe not how long they've been IBCLC, but how long they've actually been interested in working with breastfeeding mothers. Because that's also going to tell me a little bit, some differences in the myths that they're hearing and the frequency, right? I probably should have said in the last 12 months, how often have you heard this? So I didn't cap that. So I know, like I said, dissertation, you learn all the mistakes, right? And you make it better. Are there any other questions for this?
Well, I'm an old Leche League leader, and this myth thing has been around with the Leche League meetings. But I think the difference, again, I'm not, this is not research based. I think women choose to go to a Leche League meeting already have this idea, well, Leche means, total breastfeeding, no pacifiers, stick with your baby, da-da-da-da-da-da. So they are prepared for that when they go. And so they may be more likely to these white Anglo-Saxon college-educated women that go to relationship meetings who knew the myths game are actually going to learn something from it.
Yes, and they will.
They will be less likely to come in with that attitude. They're not going to Relation League to learn about infant formula and breastfeeding because they know ahead of time they probably will be vilified at that meeting if they mention it. But where a woman comes to a hospital
Yeah.
breastfeeding class, she's hoping to get more wishy-washy. I've worked, oh, so for baby, well, you're going to probably need to use formula too. Let me show you how to do that also. And so she's coming thinking she's going to be helpful with that.
Right.
And
And they're not. That's
I
not
mean,
the purpose
this
of a
is like
breastfeeding class.
children's generation. They think they know it all.
Yeah. Well, because all the information's on the internet. We just have to have a better internet presence, which is why as soon as I defend, I'll load this up and you guys can have it. But I still think I need to redo the survey nationwide. I think that's critical. That has to happen first and right away. I just don't know. I can do the statistical analysis. I don't know how to run Survey Monkey, but I know someone who does. So
It's easy. It's easy.
I figure I can do it.
Your presentation.
She can do Survey Monkey.
I just
Yeah.
got to making one for your presentation for those that are listening online.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's right. That's a good suggestion. Yes, go approach each coalition in each chapter. It's probably a really good idea to do it because I need diversity. So what we know, one of the barriers where you live is a barrier. So if you live in the southeast, it's a barrier to breastfeeding, right?
Yes.
So I was working with a statistician up in Cornell, and she goes, "If I took out a bottle, I would be ostracized."
Yes.
You know, it just isn't done at Cornell. You know?
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, that's how it is in California and UC Davis, right? But here, right, we're the southeast.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We're the southeast, so it's a little different. Our issues are a little
We
bit
still have
different.
baby wise in Tampa.
Yeah, we still have it here too. We still have it here too. I feel bad, but I try to give them Rhonda Yoder's book.
Yes.
Yeah, give them Rhonda Yoder's
A
book.
what?
Rhonda's book. Rhonda Yoder.
Yeah, Rhonda Yoder's. I
Christian parenting.
can't think of the title. Remember the author?
From a Christian perspective, it's beautiful.
Yeah, Rhonda Yoder's book is a great alternative to that. It meets their need for Christian parenting, right, and still is accurate for breastfeeding information. It's a beautiful book.
What I recommend for all my Christian parents.
Anything else? Are we pretty good?
I just wanted to say that the question you ask, you know, you come up with a question and sometimes you think you're going to get the answer you want, but you don't. And when I first started out, after La Leche Legan, I started out as an IBCLC, I had a questionnaire, and one of the questions was how long do you want to breastfeed your baby? Because I want to meet her need, her goal, help her meet her goals. It was always the same answer. As that open-ended question, I'm not getting what I want. She always put in there, as long as I can.
Yes.
So, yeah, so the next time I had them printed up, I changed it. 1 month, 2 months, for them to circle the months, you know, or more. But that told me that they don't believe they can, as long as I
Society
can.
had such a high number who felt confident that they could.
They'd made their decision. Same people that had the boomerang. They'd made their decision, and they were going to stick to it. And they were 80% college-educated women. They know how to defend their decision, right? They already know how.
Right.
That's what you learn. That's the whole idea behind the baccalaureate, is to be able to critically think and defend your ideas. You know, that's the reason we do that baccalaureate.
And because they're older, they're not 1-year-old women who are less like, oh, whatever.
Yeah.
A 31-year-old woman might have said, be more sure of herself.
Yes, yeah. Although, interestingly enough, there's sometimes it's better if you're young and you don't know any.
Right,
Yes,
right.
yes,
Some
absolutely.
of the torturous things that these women will put themselves through. It was really eye-opening. I was amazed at how much pumping and bottle feeding was going on. I'm thinking it was 8% of the moms in this study were pumping and bottle feeding. That's a huge, exclusively pumping and bottle feeding, 8%. That was a large number.
They know that the breast milk is
Yeah.
important.
Control.
They don't get the fact that breastfeeding is,
It's control.
Yeah.
So a lot of them had latch-on problems, but so here's what we were seeing too as we were going through the study. A lot of babies that lost weight in the hospital were because they're epidural babies, so they're hypervolemic, right? And then they got to pee all that off, so they lose that weight quickly in the hospital, right? So I know there's been a couple pediatric articles kind of looking at that issue, but that kind of undercut several moms that, you know, But then, what do you expect? You come in there and you get your epidural at 3 centimeters. You know, what do you think's going to happen? You know, like, please don't do that to yourself. You know, just all that fluid's got to go somewhere. It just goes in the tissue. It goes in the baby's tissue. So then the baby has this excessive weight loss, and now they have to get formula. It's medically indicated because of the weight loss. So that was the other thing. And the third thing that was quite troubling was the number of traumatic births.
Really?
Yes. You know, what I think is traumatic and what they thought are traumatic might be two different things, but I can tell you these women had post-traumatic stress disorder at 1 month out.
And those are
So who's bringing Kathy Kendall Tackett soon?
She's going to be here for La Leche conference in October.
Yeah, because I know she's done some good research
done a lot of
on that.
good
Yes,
stuff.
to
Yeah.
talk about that. Oh, I wished I read as I was learning, as I got my 4th or my 5th.
And another thing about the vaginal and C-section births, I really think, you know, after seeing mothers I saw that were having C-section births, that it's not just the procedure of the C-section, it's all that goes around it. There was something wrong with the baby, we have to have a C-section.
Right.
Something wrong with the mother, we have to have a C-section. There's a rush, there's a hurry, there's an interruption and a change of the birth plan.
Fear.
So, like my daughter-in-law, who just had a C-section, it was scheduled because baby was breached, wouldn't turn.
Right.
I got on the phone with my son, and he was just telling me all his myths. Oh, C-section babies and mothers, I'm going through it step by step. It all is up here, David, and because my daughter-in-law doesn't talk to me. But anyway, it's all up here, David, and I can see he was really fearful. That was going to carry over to his wife. And what happened? And I go, and you know, she went through that C-section, flying colors, got the baby right to the breast. And
she was prepared.
Well,
so there was no fear.
Well, I also see with the planned C-sections, the IV fluids is not as long, because it's not a pill.
Right.
Yeah. You didn't have Pitocin, you don't retain the fluids as badly. And I see the planned C-sections having better breastfeeding success than the emergency C-section.
Has anyone done that today?
She went in at night.
These are from women. That would be the place comparing the breastfeeding rates of planned and emergency C-sections and breastfeeding. That would be a very good one. And easy and cheap. Maybe you could do it. It's going to be a good one to do. I can't think. You know what? I've been a nurse, and then I became a lactation consultant. Now I'm a researcher. It's like another profession. Truly, my mind is different. My thinks are different. I cannot. So what did she say? She described the experience of the difference between a planned and emergency section. What was my response? Well, we should do a study on that. That'd be so easy. We could do it this way. You know, I could see it. I could see the design in my mind.
It frightens us to think that, like my daughter-in-law, this was an oops baby, and I know there'll be no more. But if she was going to have another one, I think she'd say, I'm having that planned C-section again. Because she really went in with a smile on her face, and she was calmer.
The risk for that, though, oh my God. They don't know what they're risking when they get a C-section. You know, I've been a maternity nurse, and I see the bad stuff, right? So it's like, oh, you don't want that.
Well,
she really don't take those risks.
One of the,
Yeah. I just wish that they didn't have that perception. I wish they understood the risk they were really taking and knew those real numbers.
To begin with, but didn't have a choice. Really.
Well, she didn't have a choice because she was breech. But if she had a baby that was in a vertex position and she could opt for a vaginal birth, it's so much safer. But it's hard to get that across because they don't really know anybody who had a pulmonary embolus or one of the complications of a C-section that can cause extreme morbidity for that mom for life. She's altered for life. Those numbers don't come out. The death numbers come out, but the extreme morbidity that can happen as a consequence, those numbers aren't recorded anywhere. So there's a lot of work to be done looking at those issues, but as I said, that my brain is in a different place now. Anything
We're
else?
so glad that we have people like you that
Yeah.
want to